Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new The National Blast podcast with Keenan Skelly. Join Keenan and guests as they blast you to a place that is certainly not boring, yet still giving you highlights from areas in cyber where key policies and legislation are needed, exist, but aren't enforced, or no one is even talking about it. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hello, everyone. It's Keenan Skelly with the National Blast. I'm so excited. And yeah, I know I say that every time, but I'm really, really excited about the guest today because we have been talking about this for a millennia. And it's all my fault that it took this long, but still. So I want to introduce Lauren and Tatyana. They're going to tell a little bit about themselves and kind of how they got roped into this madness of today, and a little bit about what they're working on in terms of privacy. So Tatyana, you want to go?
Sure. So I'm Tatyana Bolton. I'm the policy director for R Street's Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats program. I came to R Street from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And before that, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Before that, for those who don't know what CISA stands for, which surprisingly, still a large number of people don't. But you all should. So that's sort of my background. And now I work with the fantastic Lauren Zabierek on our joint effort to basically fix data security, data privacy. I mean, the two of us can do it alone. It's fine.
I'm pretty sure that we can.
Isn't that how it usually works? I mean, just a couple of badass women just going out there. It is Women's History Month, so I'm going to throw a lot of that in here.
Yeah.
Badass women.
Yeah.
Badass things. Changing the world.
Hashtag winning.
Thank you for that introduction, Tatyana, and of course, Keenan. My name is Lauren Zabierek. I run the cyber project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. So it's like this think tank within the school, within the university, but we do policy relevant research here. And I came this way just really a long kind of winding career. I started my career in the military, just like you, Keenan. And
what branch for the Army fans out there?
Okay, yeah, you're going to make me do this, aren't you?
I am. Totally.
I was in the Air Force,
Oh.
lovingly known as the Chair Force. I was not a pilot, though.
No, actually, I'm not going to give you any real crap for that because all of my duty stations as an Army, as a soldier, were at Air Force bases. And I honestly feel like those are the most magical military places in the world. So I'm not even going to give you a hard time about that. Go ahead.
You know, I didn't go to a ton of military bases, but yeah, I was mostly stationed at Langley Air Force Base, if you were ever there. So yeah, maybe we crossed paths at one point. So did a couple years in the military, got out, did a couple years of consulting, and then I went to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency where I did counterterrorism work. And I got to deploy a bunch and do some really cool things, and then had to leave government to come up to Boston to be with my husband. And that's when I made that pivot into cyber. I was lucky enough that the startup that I joined, Recorded Future, was open to hiring someone who did not have a cyber background. And so I was so fortunate, and especially because it gave me such a view of how these companies and organizations across the country were really dealing with cyber threats. And this was early 2016. So it was an interesting time. And that really led me to want to focus on cyber policy, so that when I got to the Kennedy School and then, got to study under Eric Rosenbach, my now boss, and then he asked me to apply for this role. So I've been here for a couple of years. It's been incredible, life-changing. And through the course of that, I have been able to meet amazing people such as yourselves, Keenan and Tatyana. It's been just, the best thing ever. And we are working on, as Tatyana said, data security, data privacy legislation, really trying to identify the current roadblocks to getting it passed. So really trying to say what those issues are and trying to come up with actionable solutions for that.
I'm so excited that there are people like both of you that are working on this, because it's kind of become a running joke on the podcast that the whole rest of the world, especially Europe, is so far ahead of us on privacy, and we still haven't been able to pass any kind of meaningful privacy legislation. And I think that there's a big piece of that is because we're America, right? And there are a couple of factors that go into that. One of those factors is there are always big tech companies who are lobbying to say, well, we're trying to do this and we're trying to do this. We can't protect everyone's privacy, right? And then at the same time, there's a lot of folks who have a very Americanized view of all of my stuff should be private. The government shouldn't know anything about me. Nobody should know anything about me. And often it's kind of hard to bridge that gap between the two. So tell me a little bit about the project that you guys are working on and how it kind of tackles just the American problem of privacy.
Well, we're starting with three sort of very specific issues.
At the outset of this project, both of us, I think, were exploring this need for data privacy in the United States. A couple of my students had done some papers that really explored this topic, and it really gave me the understanding of why data security and data privacy, really the privacy aspect, was so important. It was preventing things like research and development on artificial intelligence, and it was causing just, I think, trillions of dollars in losses between businesses, between, the United States and Europe, for instance. And so that really compelled me to say, I think this is something that we need to think about. And so I saw that Tatyana was also doing some research in this space, and I reached out to her and we started to talk. And she, of course, has always said, you know what, why don't we work together on this? Between the two of our institutions, which, as you can imagine, Harvard is probably a little bit more left-leaning, and our street, probably a little bit, in the opposite direction. So if we can sort of come at this from a bipartisan standpoint and really try to get more stakeholders sort of under the tent to really talk about and think about these issues, then I think that we can have some real impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love the bipartisan piece of that. I really do. And I think that privacy has to be that. I think in DC, in all the time that I've lived here, the last couple of years have been some of the most polarized on a variety of topics. But when it comes to privacy, I think we went from maybe privacy is a good thing and we should look at it, to some people thinking that privacy is irrelevant. And again, that goes back to the challenge that both of you and your organizations must be facing, really trying to overcome that gap to make this just an issue for the people, not a partisan issue.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll add is that it really is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for us is that people don't believe that it can happen. And so there's become this like 20-year, there's like this 20-year buildup of stalled progress. And we need to get over that. And I think there's absolutely ways that we can move from talking just like PRA, no PRA, preemption, not preemption, to the actual, concepts in between that we can agree on, right? We've talked to take preemption, for example. We've talked to a number of different stakeholders. We've met with over probably 50 or 60 different stakeholders from industry groups, companies themselves, consumer advocates, academics, other think tanks. And we've gotten to a place where a lot of people agree on a number of issues on preemption. For example, excluding certain federal legislation like HIPAA and GLBA and student privacy, because people agree that, any legislation on privacy can't include any of those bills because it would just fall under its own weight. And so we've kind of gotten consensus on that. There's also particular state areas of concern that have been traditional, areas that states that states legislate on, and we don't want to touch that either. Give the states their due in terms of being able to legislate for the particulars of their state, and that's fine. And we've listed, I think, about 11 different areas where that are traditional areas of state control that we would exclude from the preemption. But that at least gets us closer to where we can have some consensus.
Yeah. And on that note too, Tatyana, especially where there's the idea that there are people who are saying it's never going to happen. And Keenan, also to your point about, certain companies lobbying for or against, I think it's really important to note that everyone that we're talking to wants this. And that includes those tech companies. They want a privacy bill because, on the end of the spectrum, for consumer advocacy, yeah, we want to protect people. And on the other end, we also want to protect business, right? And innovation and things like that. And then I guess if we're looking at, maybe it's not a spectrum, maybe it's like a round ball of issues, but then we also have national security issues too, right? And protecting people in that way, but also, fueling research and innovation and development for critical national security technologies like artificial intelligence and things like that. So there's so many reasons why a lot of people, a lot of organizations, a lot of institutions really want this and why we need it. And so it's like, we're just trying to find those little areas that are preventing, I think, the conversation from moving forward, and then trying to present some actionable ways forward so that we can actually keep this moving.
Yeah, I think, Tatyana, you mentioned a little bit earlier that there were 3 issues that you guys were really kind of focused on in this. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we looked at preemption. That's the first one. And I think, like I just mentioned, we found consensus on that, I think. Generally that's every law that passes has to deal with this. So, it's almost surprising that we haven't been able to find compromise. The second issue is private right of action. So whether or not individuals can sue, that is probably the most contentious still, because there's a lot of different opinions as to whether or not you should have a private right of action at all. We are a fairly litigious society, so it's not surprising that we want to be able to sue companies when we feel like they're not following the law. And then the third area is the role of the FTC and how enforcement is handled. That ties into PRA as well, because we talk about sort of the different ways you can enforce a law, right? From federal enforcement through the FTC, most likely a privacy bureau. If such a bill were to come to fruition, it would most likely be the FTC through a privacy bureau that the federal government would enforce. Then state AGs and the role the states would play. And then third is that individual enforcement and private right of action. So that's the way we sort of started thinking about it. And Lauren took over Lauren's running the FTC portion of this. So I'll put it over to her because she's got the pen.
Actually, on that very specific topic, I believe there was, I know there was a bill that was coming forward to fund the FTC about $10 million, 10 billion. I think it was $10 million over the next couple of years, to focus directly on privacy reporting and data, which is an interesting kind of mix when you see all of the bills that have come out directed at CISA maintaining kind of a reporting structure. And so is that part of what you guys have been considering? Is that particular bill, and how does that fit into the whole piece?
I don't know if we've necessarily looked at that particular bill, but certainly the issue of how the FTC could be resourced better to do that job of enforcement, of protection of privacy. And, especially on that note with CISA, right? We understand that there are going to be other agencies that really need to coordinate with the FTC on that, especially on the data security side of the house. But where CISA doesn't have an enforcement role, then they would actually provide, I think, more of that consultative, more, advisory action, so that the FTC could then take that and create the appropriate rules. So the FTC would have this special rulemaking authority. And we go in this paper, we go into the different types of rulemaking authorities that the FTC could actually use to create those rules. We are talking about enforcement and how that actually happens. Also talking about capacity right now versus, what we would need to actually get to, I think, a robust enforcement stature. And also looking at the areas for rulemaking. So one of the biggest things that we have heard and have been working on is this concept of targeted rulemaking. So for instance, right now, the FTC could use something, and I think is trying to use something called the MAGMOS rulemaking authority. And essentially they can make rules on what they deem needs guidance around. But this concept of targeted rulemaking authority essentially says that actually most of this law, or that Congress would actually pass, most of those provisions would actually be in the law, but there are some very specific areas that the FTC could then actually make rules on. And that's really meant to leave it to their expertise on those areas, but it's also to ensure that the law is not obsolete and that it can actually keep up with changing technology. So things like what is sensitive covered data, and looking at things like explicit consent or manipulation and biometric data, things like that. And then, but again, keeping it very targeted to those sorts of areas, but having Congress actually pass the law of what is allowed and what isn't. And then, again, how they would enforce it. And even a question of, would they put out different guidance, almost like affirmative guidance to companies, what you could do, what you should do. So those are some of the things that we are working through in these papers.
And on the money part, on the funding side, we also sort of looked at Build Back Better and what it included in terms of the FTC, which was $1 billion for privacy and a privacy bureau. That amount was cut down to 500 million. And so we sort of ran with that number. And, it was moving fairly well along in that process. So we felt like it was a number that might pass through Congress. If there was consensus around 500, we're happy to use that. So we sort of created a rule of five. So what we said was 500 million for over 5 years for 500 people. Because, there's the capacity issue is a serious one. There can't be effective enforcement at the FTC without increased capacity. Right now, we have not even remotely enough people, around 60 or so, that are working on privacy within the FTC. And that's for the entirety of the United States. Arguably, you can say Ireland's team is bigger. And Ireland is the size of Connecticut? I'm kidding. Ireland's bigger than Connecticut.
Hey.
But you get my point. So, because of the rules of GDPR and like all of their enforcement actions, they've certainly staffed up. So, perhaps it's comparing apples and oranges, but I think it just goes to show that there's a lack of capacity here in the FTC in the US, and we want to try to address that.
Yeah. And I think too, sorry, Keenan.
No, please go ahead.
I think too that there is some concern, of course, on the right side of the aisle, right, with big government and funding the FTC so much that it's this big unwieldy organization and it's going to be so cumbersome to businesses, and that's not what we want. We want to resource them appropriately so that they can look at across the spectrum what's going on in the privacy space, what's going on at different businesses, the ability to identify where businesses are, messing up or creating harms and things like that, and then remediate that. And, when we're talking about enforcement and potentially collecting fines, again, this isn't to, just plus up their own coffers, right? This is meant to try to get compliance for the law. But then also at the same time, I mentioned these affirmative things. We want to make sure that the law and the rules are very clear so that companies and organizations know how to comply, can easily do it. And hopefully they have sort of less fear around that.
So from the perspective of, let's say, devil's advocate, how does this kind of fit in with reporting legislation? How does this fit in with the SEC? How does this kind of fit into the fact that if you have a data and privacy violation with the FTC, you also very likely have had some kind of breach of that information, right? So how are those things working together in the way that you guys are proposing this? And then is the SEC a part of that conversation in what they can do and what they can charge against companies?
So, I think that obviously interagency coordination will be necessary if this passes. We've seen, I would argue, the most significant shift in cybersecurity legislation over the course of the last year alone that we've ever seen. And, this would sort of add to that. And I think what that means is the agencies that are responsible for tackling cybersecurity within the government, CISA, FBI, NSA, the White House, obviously the NCD, among others. Obviously, the other agencies that are responsible for the different sectors like Treasury and Energy need to get involved. But the government has that process, right? Like they have an interagency process. They have, they have ways to meet, to discuss, to figure out who's responsible for what. Obviously, a ton of ink will be spilled trying to figure out, what that process will look like within the federal government. Certainly, there's a role for the SEC to play in terms of breaches. I think, they're currently one of the strongest regulators on the in cybersecurity as it stands. But I think that, we can't let the fear of, sort of complicated bureaucratic wrangling stop us from achieving what we know to be right and good, which is stronger data security and stronger privacy policies. We need those for consumers, for businesses, for the government. I think, in fact, data security, data privacy legislation will work really well almost in tandem with cyber incident reporting legislation, in that it'll be able to create that resilience and the requirements for those better data security practices that will protect people's privacy, but at the same time reduce breaches. And so what it's some of the basic blocking and tackling that we've just been missing because we've been trying to do this voluntarily and it's just not been successful, right? I think that, Ann Neuberger today gave a presser saying that she's frustrated about the fact that companies are still being hacked through known vulnerabilities. It's very rare that it's a 0 day that gets you. It's really just known vulnerabilities that are out there you haven't patched yet. So I think in requiring data security practices through a data security and data privacy bill will help regulators and help companies make sure that they're working together to address these issues before they happen.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I was going to say, yeah. And I actually would add on to that in a very specific way. When it comes to the breach notification and privacy, I was at an event a couple months ago and talking about this continued need to share information and do it in a very sustained, holistic, institutionalized way. And someone came up to me after and said, I would love to share more information for the government, but I have all these privacy considerations and liability concerns. And so I think that having a law, which again provides very specific guidance on how to actually comply and protect people's data, I think that's going to help us even more to get more data and hopefully go a long way towards raising our collective resilience and security.
I totally agree with that. But I also, as a small business owner, I see the hard part of that, which is, especially if we're talking about critical infrastructure, we're talking about owners and operators. They don't always have the bottom line to be able to support that. And that's where, a lot of these things start to fall short. Is they say, great, that there's regulation, but I'm never going to be able to do that. I have a sysadmin who's running my entire, security program, and I don't know how to get beyond that. So what are some ways that you guys think that can be addressed through this privacy legislation?
Yeah, I mean, we thought about that. Like, we don't want this to be burdensome for the majority of businesses that are small and medium-sized businesses. Because again, the goal is not to create new regulation. The goal is to create stronger, more resilient networks. That's good for everyone. Absolutely. And so for small and medium-sized businesses, right, those that like your business or your neighborhood dry cleaner or my mom's, like law firm, which has 2 people, it's just her basically, we wouldn't put the same sort of stringent standards on them because you guys aren't collecting the data. You're not collecting the amounts of data we're talking about. We're trying to, address the issues that are happening at the high, at a high level where, hundreds of thousands of data entries are happening on a, hourly basis, if not minute by minute. Like the amount of data that, we've been hoovering up on the internet and through, various email and, sweepstakes campaigns and grocery store, VIP programs, whatever. It's collecting so much information that people just feel like they almost have to basically give up their privacy in order to participate in today's society. And that's just not true. And there's ways that companies can go about minimizing their data collection. And I think that's what we're trying to incentivize, right? Minimizing data collection to the data that you actually need, instead of just putting out a broad sweep of, and just collecting everything you can because it's easy to do that, right? Because then it creates all these problems on the back end where companies then get breached, and then you didn't just accidentally, release 10,000 people's information, just their name and phone number. No, you actually went ahead and collected their social security number and address and email and where, whatever
religious
else.
Preference and shopping preferences.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And so that's the stuff that we're targeting. For the small and medium-sized businesses, we've made an exclusion. They wouldn't be within the scope of this, the bill as we're drafting it. It would exclude small businesses that don't hold lots of data or don't collect lots of data. That includes all of the ones I just mentioned, but it does include small businesses that do collect huge amounts of data. We didn't want to give a sort of a flat get out of jail free. Yeah. I'd like a get out of jail free card for any business that remains under 500 employees, because with even 20 employees right now on the internet, you can collect millions of people's data. So, the question is about how small the business is, and then also how much data they collect. And so if you fall under certain thresholds, right, and these are, by the way, thresholds that not we created, but have been proposed previously in other legislation and have some sort of standing in Congress, so that we put some kind of restriction around the scope.
And it sounds like that was kind of getting to the question that I really wanted to ask was, is this really structured to be tiered for different types of businesses and different types of entities? Because that's something that is often really difficult with legislation of this nature or reporting or anything that falls into this, is you have to consider the capabilities of the actual company. So that's great to hear that those things are being taken into consideration and how their reporting would be different for privacy and data.
Yeah. And, it's not just now and what we have been doing, but even this, idea of looking ahead and looking at things like smart cities, right? And how they're collecting or will be collecting data, how all of our internet connected things are collecting data. And then on top of that, it's how you're actually processing that data and then making decisions based on that process as well.
How my Tesla knows where I am at every second of every day.
Oh my gosh. And how my phone like reminded me that I'm going to the airport and was like, would you want to coordinate your Google Map schedule to make sure that you get there on time? I'm like, oh my God.
Right. Or
I was a little freaked out coming back from the airport last time when they were like, oh, you just landed. Would you like to get some Uber Eats for when you get home? And I'm like, oh my God.
We've gone a step too far here.
I feel like I'm being stalked. How do you know what is going on right now?
Or even, I was at the doctor's recently and they were like, here's a link to register and enter your information ahead of time to save time. And they asked for a lot of things. And I was like, I'm not putting this on the internet because I don't know what you're going to do with it and why do you need it? But, to this conversation we were just having about those small businesses that maybe don't collect a lot of data or do and have, the number of employees or revenue and things like that. This is something I've thought a lot about too. And I know that states are really getting into this whole privacy game. And I'm wondering, if there's a way for states to maybe provide resources or very, specific information, just per state or something like that. But again, having, this federal law to really guide what should and shouldn't be done. But again, more on the, I don't know, again, that positive enforcement sort of aspect of it. Because these small, like I said, these doctors' offices, I need to know that they're doing the right thing with our information because there are targets for sure. And as we know, bad actors can do bad things with this data.
I'm going to tell a quick story because it's super relevant right now and talking about a medical office. And I was trying to make an appointment and their voicemail told me that if I wanted to make the appointment and I wanted to talk about my medications, which is what I called in for, was a medication refill, that I needed to leave the medication, what it was treating, my credit card number, my email address, my phone number. And it went on like to list for the things like my favorite color and what kind of underwear I like. And I was like, are you, what? And I lost it a little bit as a security person on the voicemail. And then immediately they called me back and they're like, well, we can just take that information over the phone. I'm like, how is that better? And why do you need to know all that information? Why is that? And then they were like, well, we have a website where you can enter it. It was not a secured or encrypted website. It was like, this is literally the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life. And so
in this day and age,
rookie mistake, hate to see it happen.
It is. But, there are a lot, especially in the smaller businesses, the smaller legal practices, the smaller medical practices, that it's just not something that they have time to consider or just.
No, and there's just like one person usually who's like running as the office as an office manager who may or may not have any idea what cybersecurity is. And like, I go in there and I'm just thinking like that person is holding our data and like fairly sensitive data. Like it went obviously from just paper records now in like folders in their office, which like so unlikely to get stolen, right? Like nobody's going to break into a doctor's office, to get like the files of some random patient, which for the record is in such a system that like literally nobody knows how to get in there anyway. But to a place where they're all online and like don't get me wrong, I want digital records in medical offices because it's incredibly frustrating, like trying to go between different offices. And like, I do this for my family. Like I go and I try to coordinate care and it's extremely difficult. So like, there's a huge benefit to doing this, but like, where are we on the back end of like, the data security aspect of it? And that's the whole point. Like there's so many different reasons why we need this. And I think like there's pragmatic solutions that people just need to hash those out and just let's get this done.
Amen.
I know. Well, now we should just go home because we fixed it.
Right. That was really easy. That was like
we just did it. It was fine. Well,
Why?
when Lauren, when R Street Harvard and Corey Simpson, our other partner, puts this out, that's the answer. So you guys should just support it and, publicly, very publicly call your senators and tell them that this is the right thing to do.
So
And there you go.
Actually, I want to back up for just a second. Lauren, earlier you mentioned that a lot of the companies who do lobbying, the tech companies, they want this too. Can you talk a little bit about why they want this? And is it because they want at least a baseline to be able to follow and they have no idea what to do? Or is there other pushback? Like how is that working?
Yeah, it's definitely more on the economic side of things, but this idea of having a patchwork of laws is very onerous for a business. They don't want that. It's also very confusing, I think, for consumers as well. But if they have to put more resources towards figuring out the different laws in all these different states and of course, different countries, that I think it slows things down. It hampers innovation. It delays, I think, services basically that people are paying for. So we don't want that. We want there to be, yes, this baseline law as they do. That's very clear, that provides that guidance of what they can and cannot do, provides these standards, if you will, not standards in the technical sense, but standards for behavior and use of data and protection. So there's really no ambiguity there. They want clarity, right? They want clarity in operating.
Like a baseline where we can start here, and that gives us a starting point. And that's
exactly
important when the bottom line comes into play.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm really excited about this. When is this coming out? When can people jump on this and start calling their senators and really harassing them about the importance of data privacy? Because I'm totally here for that.
Well, yesterday, but we are wrapping up all of our sort of research, and while we're continuing sort of stakeholder engagement, because I think that's critical to getting this over the finish line. There's obviously a number of really fantastic programs that have worked on this for years that we're working with, and I think so. We'll be wrapping up our work in April, when we have an event, April 25th. To talk about some of our recommendations. We're going to be putting out some sort of summary recommendations at that event, and then we're going to be releasing, I think, our documents in full. We have actually 5 of them at this point. One that talks about scope, one that talks about PRA, preemption, FTC, and then one that we haven't actually touched on, but is equally important, which is civil rights. Yeah. And so that'll be coming out probably early in May. So
can you talk about this event where everything's coming out and where people can go to get excited and go to that event? And
yeah, so the event should be live on our street's website and on Harvard's website, probably. When we so our street cyber will host the event. It's at the National Press Club at 11:30 on April 25th. It's actually in person, people.
Yay!
In person. I know.
People.
With lunch, guys. With lunch.
Wow.
So there's no reason not to go. Really. That's what I say.
Totally gonna go.
You should go. It's gonna be amazing. Right now. We have Kent Walker from Google, who's gonna be keynoting. He's going to talk about sort of privacy from one of these, big companies that collects a lot of data and their perspective, how they think about it, how they think about moving away from the notice and consent model, and how he thinks about duty of loyalty from a company's perspective. And then we're going to have a great panel following that with Nishant Baharia from Uber and Lartiz Tiffith from IAB, formerly Amazon, and a number of other soon to be announced speakers. I can't confirm them yet. I can't talk about it yet, but they're going to be really great. So yeah, it's going to be fantastic.
That's really exciting. I'm excited for this. I know everybody that listens to the show, we talk about privacy and data so often, even however random the scope of our topics are, whether it's, the federal revenge porn legislation, or whether we're talking about the G7 and what people are willing to do from country to country to protect and defend, each other's nations. Privacy and data is really the other side of the cybersecurity coin. And it really is important, and we have to start making progress forward. Otherwise, we're going to get really just overwhelmed with this. So final thoughts before we wrap up, what do you want to see with this? Do you want to see, obviously, you want to see it just get passed no matter what, and then everybody just pays attention and doesn't argue and, try to be a little pain in the butt. But what else? Final thoughts.
Well, correct. I would just say that I would like for our country to stop acting like little children and just, agree to something. I want to see a cultural shift. I want to see a shift from us thinking about privacy and data security as separate issues, right? Privacy thought of as a tech issue and not a cybersecurity issue. They go together. And then moving away from this concept that moving away from this concept that privacy is something that you aren't really due. It's just something that is a bonus, right? To thinking about privacy as inherent to the way in which we live our lives and have lived our lives. And it's something that you should just expect in a regular course of business, and that it's not an additional thing that you're asking for.
Absolutely.
I think that's right. Changing the culture on this and making everything sort of secure and private by design, right? And not only that, but again, we really hadn't touched on this in the discussion, but also fair, and in terms of the way we collect the data and also process and use that data and then make decisions on top of that, making sure that that's fair too. Tatyana said something earlier about, this promise of technology, right? We want to use technology. Technology makes lives easier. But I think for so long, we've just neglected the security and privacy aspect of it in the name of, great innovation and commerce and things like that. We need to bring this back in line with, the needs of the people in our nation and our national security. And so changing that conversation. Sorry, go ahead.
And cultural values, just that this is something that should be instilled in us as a culture, is to protect our information. And that gets difficult when we start talking about younger people right now who spend most of their time, in a digital world where they're always on Twitch with their friends, or they're always streaming with their friends. And it gets really difficult if we have nothing in place to kind of guide that generation moving forward. I mean, we're already bad at it.
Yeah, it's true.
Yes, we are. But maybe, I'm going to play the eternal optimist here, as I do, and just say that, maybe they'll be better than us at it, because they grow up in it. Maybe they just inherently understand how to protect themselves better.
Maybe.
Just like we understand how to use iPhones better than our parents, right?
But I want to be the ones to figure it out for them, though.
It's true. It's true. I don't want to wait that long.
Yeah.
I want this to happen now.
Yeah. Let's do what we can to protect ourselves and the future generations. There's so much work to be done on that front across all kinds of domains. If we can get this done, that'd be amazing.
I just hope that in 30 years, it'll be just as weird not to have a privacy standard or a company that's not taking your privacy and data security into account, as weird as it would be to buy a car without a seatbelt, right?
Yeah,
I want it to be that intrinsic. It's just it would be completely odd to buy, a car with no anti-lock brakes. Right. Those didn't used to be standard. Seatbelts didn't used to be standard, but we significantly reduced fatalities in car crashes by making those required. And I think that we can do the same thing for our digital economy.
Such a good analogy.
Yeah, I
I'm
love
here
that.
for you.
I love it when people talk about, well, driver's licenses didn't used to be a thing until everybody was killing each other and running over other people's horses. And then that became a thing. And, sometimes regulation when applied correctly is life altering. It's life changing for everyone. And I think this is where privacy and data really comes in.
Yeah. I mean, cyber is just the wild, wild west right now, It's not crazy to think that we need to put some rules of the road up.
Absolutely. And it's been too long.
Like driving without street signs.
Yeah. Well, and on that point, just real quick, like this discussion about, regulations like seatbelts and anti-lock brakes and things like that. I bet back then people were like, oh, this is going to be so burdensome for, our technology development. But look what it did. It saved lives on one hand, which is what we should be doing anyway, protecting life. But also that innovation has just skyrocketed, right? Like innovation has not been hampered by making sure that things are safe. So I think that the same thing will happen here.
I love that comment. And I had a guest actually a few months ago who was coming from a more European kind of point of view. And she said that in Europe, privacy and cybersecurity directly equate to safety, just safety, which is, I think, a foreign concept here in America, not something we get. And the analogy that she used, I thought, was really apropos. In Europe and countries in Europe, they've experienced world wars where data was used against them in the worst possible ways, where registries identifying your religion or where you came from, those things led to wars, to massive wars that decimated populations. And that's something that we haven't experienced. So we're coming at this with a slightly new perspective of, okay, it's important, but Europeans see it from a very different standpoint. It's about safety. It's about personal safety. And I think
I think Jen Easterly really does a good job at equating those things too, with her Shields Up initiative, with SCISA's Shields Up initiative, and talking about how these threats are threats not just to computers, but to public safety and those essential services. So I think you're spot on with that.
You guys, we're going to have to do this again. We're going to have a follow-on after the launch and the release, and after everybody that listens to this show calls their senator and makes it happen.
Yes, please.
It's so great to talk to you both, and I really do want both of you to come back on.
We'd love to.
Yeah, that would be amazing. This has been such a fun conversation.
Yay!
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the National Blast podcast with Keenan Skelly. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.